In 2007, on the dry, high desert of eastern Oregon, Scott Campbell stood beside a channel nearly 6 feet deep, cutting across the 140,000-acre ranch he had just bought. Camp Creek was dry for roughly 11 months of the year, and fish had been gone for longer than most people could remember. Yet Campbell's answer was to put even more rock into it, a decision that would eventually get him fined by the state of Oregon. He began stacking rock, gravel, and juniper logs into roughly 100 low structures spread across 3.5 miles of creek. They were never meant to stop the water completely. It still slipped through the gaps, only more slowly. Then something unexpected began to happen. The ground along the channel stayed wet longer. Camp Creek was still flowing in August, and trout appeared in reaches where fish had nearly become a memory. But just as the creek seemed to be coming back to life, Campbell ran into trouble. When he started, this was little more than a dry trench. By the time the work began to succeed, it had become flowing water with fish, which meant those piles of rock now fell under state waterway rules. A man was fined after making a creek function better. So, what had happened to this valley long before Campbell arrived? And how could a few low piles of rock hold on to something the landscape had been losing for generations? Nearly 2 centuries before Scott Campbell arrived in Silvies Valley, the water here had already begun to change. Starting in the 1820s, beavers were deliberately trapped and removed. Their disappearance took countless natural dams with them. The barriers that once slowed spring runoff were gone, and the creeks began moving faster through the valley. The faster the water moved, the deeper it cut. Over time, the creek bed dropped, the banks grew taller, and the flat ground that once flooded every spring ended up nearly 6 feet above the flow. Scientists call this channel incision. To a rancher looking down from the bank, it simply looks like a ditch carved far too deep. Then came another pressure. Large cattle herds in the 1880s stripped away streamside vegetation whose roots had helped hold the soil together. Over the next century, suppressing nearly every natural fire allowed western juniper to spread into country it had never dominated before. Too many cattle, too little fire, and more trees pulling water from the ground. By the time Campbell bought the ranch, Silvies Valley was still receiving roughly the same rainfall it had around 1800. The water had not disappeared from the sky. It simply no longer stayed in the landscape long enough. Campbell began looking at the valley differently. The same rainfall could fall on one place that behaved like a gutter and another that worked like a sponge. If the real problem was not a lack of water, but how quickly it escaped, could an entire valley be made to hold on to it for months longer? Campbell was not trying to seal the creek behind a concrete wall. He stacked rock into low steps, allowing water to keep moving through the gaps, just more slowly than before. As the current lost speed, water began spreading sideways, sinking into the gravel beneath the valley floor, and remaining underground for longer. Sediment also settled behind each structure, gradually lifting the creek bed back toward its old floodplain. That set off a chain of changes. A higher water table kept streamside grass green later into the summer. Stronger roots held the banks together, erosion slowed, and the creek stopped cutting downward as aggressively as it once had. What Campbell was trying to store was not simply a pond on the surface, but a much larger reserve hidden beneath the ground. But the more results people saw, the more questions they asked. Would slower water become too warm for fish? Would sediment clog the creek? Could the rock structures block fish moving upstream? In a separate study, 91% of coho and 54% of steelhead moved below similar structures were back upstream within 3 weeks. Then came a harder question. If Campbell was holding water longer on his ranch, was someone downstream losing theirs? Some reports said more water actually left the ranch later in the season. But the research on Sylvies also acknowledged a major weakness. Most of the reported benefits came from the owners themselves, with no independent baseline or control site. So what do you think? If a method brings flowing water back, fish return, and the land stays greener, but independent evidence is still incomplete, should regulators allow it to continue or demand stronger data first? I would really like to know your answer. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. The rock structures were originally built for a practical reason: keep the grass greener and provide more water for livestock. But then Sylvies Valley began returning things Campbell had never put there. Red band trout appeared in the Sylvies River, Camp Creek, and Hay Creek, even in reaches where the Wildlife Agency had no historical record of fish. No one released them. Then the beavers came back. No trucks, no relocation. They returned on their own once the creeks were shallow enough, the banks were green enough, and the habitat was worth living in again. From that point on, the rock piles were no longer just human-built structures. The beavers began taking over the work Campbell had started. Then, in the summer of 2015, a planned burn escaped and spread across thousands of acres of dry country. The flames moved toward Camp Creek, but when they reached the wet meadow, they stopped. Grass and sedge rooted in saturated ground were still green in the heat of summer, forming a strip of living fuel that the fire could not easily cross. The same piles of rock that had once gotten Campbell fined now sat inside a valley with fish, beavers, and a wet corridor capable of changing the path of a wildfire. Nearly 20 years later, the rock structures were no longer a handful of isolated experiments. The Forest Service recorded roughly 640 structures across 18 miles of the Sylvies River and 6 tributary creeks. But one question still followed Campbell. If cattle had helped damage these valleys in the first place, why was his ranch still running about 4,000 head? Campbell argued that the difference was how the animals were managed. Instead of leaving the same herd in a wet meadow from spring through winter, cattle were moved quickly between pastures. Some areas were grazed only briefly and later in the season, and sensitive ground was fenced off. Much of that information still came from the ranch itself, but Campbell's economics caught the attention of other ranchers. Give up 1 acre to wetland, and you could gain roughly 6 acres of better pasture. Traditional stream restoration could cost 6 figures per mile, while the Forest Service placed Campbell's approach below about $20,000 in the case it described. Then the phone calls started. Ranchers were not asking how to stack rocks. They wanted to know how to get past the permit office. The first bill failed in 2015. A second failed in 2019. Then, in May 2021, Governor Kate Brown signed a law creating a program for environmental restoration weirs, opening a legal path for the same kind of structures that had once gotten Campbell fined. But Oregon creating a legal path for environmental restoration weirs did not end the argument. Water Watch of Oregon opposed the earlier bills not because it wanted stream restoration stopped, but because of a simpler question: where was the proof? The new program runs for 10 years, yet much of the monitoring relies on photographs. Pictures can show greener vegetation, but they cannot reveal exactly how far the water table rose, what happened to fish populations, or how an entire watershed will respond over time. The Forest Service has also warned that these results do not translate equally to every valley. In the wrong conditions, the structures can clog culverts, flood hayfields, move gravel downstream, or simply fail. Sylvies shows remarkable signs of recovery, but many of its reported benefits still have not been independently measured over the long term. And at the lower end of Camp Creek, where the fire once stopped, the contradiction is visible on the ground. On one side are gray sagebrush skeletons and hard, dry soil. On the other is soft earth, green sedge, and the sound of water still running in August. The same sky, only a few hundred yards apart, with the rock piles that once got Scott Campbell fined sitting between them. If rules designed to stop people from damaging nature can also stop them from repairing it, then who should decide what counts as harm and what counts as restoration? If you enjoy stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.